Hey everyone, this is a video about a topic that I've touched on many times, but this is a video that I hope will be the definitive video about why women should not be allowed to vote. Now I'm going to list 3 reasons why women shouldn't be allowed to vote, in ascending order from relatively unimportant to the most important and critical reason why women shouldn't be allowed to vote. Now I ask that you carefully and objectively listen to my reasons and let them roll around in your mind before you simply thumb down the video and call me a bigot. Now, after watching the video, after considering my arguments, if you choose simply to dismiss them as the ravings of a bigoted puppet, that's fine. I understand that. You're just an idiot. However, let's get started with So in a very early video of mine, I talked about how women caused the welfare state, and that was incorrect. I was set straight by a few of my subscribers, but I want to fine-tune the concept that women's suffrage absolutely grows the welfare state and makes it impossible to reform. So let's list a few studies. Links will be in the description. And some of these studies were actually very sympathetic and encouraging of women's enfranchisement. So these aren't biased sources favoring me. These are sometimes even feminist sources arguing for the opposite of what I'm arguing for. So let's start with one called The Enfranchisement of Women in the Welfare State. It says, quote, "Women display a higher preference for public goods, which may reflect different degrees of risk aversion and different perceptions of the role of government as a potential insurer. Gender differences in the taste for public goods has been documented in several contexts. Family structure can be an explanation for this pattern, so that institutions affecting the stability of family structure, such as divorce, can be related to women's preferences," unquote. It makes intuitive sense that women desire to be protected and provided for. In fact, when you look at voting patterns, single women overwhelmingly vote for Democrats in the US. And all women, 100% of women, are voting based on who provides for them. The single women are voting for the Democrats because the Democrats are giving them welfare benefits. They are providing for these women directly. In the case of married Republican women, they're voting because the high taxes that the Democrats would impose would harm their husbands and thus their own income. In both cases, these women are expecting to be provided for by someone, either the government directly or their husbands. So in order to have women vote conservatively, to vote for small government and low taxes, you merely have to guarantee all women a middle-class provider husband. But because that's impossible, you're always going to have unmarried women vote for welfare, and it just makes intuitive sense why they would. Anyway, moving on to another study called "Did Women's Suffrage Change the Size and Scope of Government?" It says, quote, "Giving women the right to vote significantly changed American politics from the very beginning. Suffrage coincided with immediate increases in state government expenditures and revenue, and these effects continued growing as more women took advantage of the franchise. Similar changes occurred at the federal level, as female suffrage led to more liberal voting records for the state's U.S. House and Senate delegations. In the Senate, suffrage changed voting behavior by the amount equal to almost 20% of the difference between Republican and Democrat senators. Suffrage also coincided with changes in the probability that prohibition would be enacted and changes in divorce laws," unquote. In another study looking specifically at Switzerland called "Women's Suffrage and the Growth of the Welfare State," it says, quote, "Evidence indicates that this extension of voting rights increased Swiss social welfare spending by 28% and increased the overall size of the Swiss government," unquote. And in an educational paper written by a feminist about how women and women's suffrage and the feminist movement spurred the creation of the welfare state, in a paper called "The Historical Foundations of Women's Power in the Creation of the American Welfare State, 1830 to 1930, it contains the following, quote, "Linked in various capacities with a full range of male-dominated political social groups who advocated for some sort of social welfare legislation, from municipal socialists to the National Civic Foundation, they tipped the balance of the political process heavily in favor of such legislation. Middle-class women became central to the debate about the welfare of working people, job-related health perils, the length of the working day, the need for a, quote, living wage that absorbed the nation's courts, its legislative bodies, and public opinion forums at the height of the American industrialization between 1900 and 1920, unquote." In summary, when women were given the right to vote, they overwhelmingly sided with socialists and those who wanted to enact a welfare state. This is precisely why the progressive movement of the early 1900s in the US made giving women the right to vote primary on their agenda. They needed women's votes in order to get the rest of their agenda passed, because women are a natural constituency for those who want to grow the size and scope of government, because they want to be protected and provided for. And in the absence of a husband, they look to the government to fill that role. So if you favor small government, if you favor limited government, if you favor human freedom, women should not be given the right to vote. However, I realize this is a shaky argument because not everybody is against a welfare state. There are many, many men who are socialists, who believe that a welfare state is good. And this argument would not sway them. In fact, they would say women should absolutely have the right to vote, if only because they allow the creation of a welfare state, because I believe in one. So this is the weakest argument. Arguably, it's one of the only arguments that I've actually heard by people such as Ann Coulter. But this is actually the least important reason why women shouldn't be allowed to vote. So let's move on to number 2. So this one's going to require a little bit of backstory. If you're not familiar with sociology, I want to talk about Carol Gilligan's theory of moral development. So I'm going to play the following video and then talk about it.
Gilligan proposed the stages of the ethics of care theory, which addresses what makes actions right or wrong. Gilligan's theory focused on both care-based morality and justice-based morality. Care-based morality is based on the following principles. It emphasizes interconnectedness and universality. Acting justly means avoiding violence and helping those in need. Care-based morality is thought to be more common in girls because of their connections to their mothers. Because girls remain connected to their mothers, they are less inclined to worry about issues of fairness. Justice-based morality is based on the following principles. It views the world as being composed of autonomous individuals who interact with another. Acting justly means avoiding inequality. It's thought to be more common in boys because of their need to differentiate themselves and their mothers. Because they are separated from their mothers, boys become more concerned with the concept of inequality. Researchers have found a tendency for males to adopt the justice perspective and for females to be more likely than males to adopt the caring perspective.
Now, first off, you kind of have to dismiss the whole, social construct bullshit. That's just part of modern academia. They admit, even feminist scholars and sociologists admit that boys have a concept of justice-based morality, while girls have a concept of care-based morality. And this is extremely important. Extremely important. And the reason why is care-based morality has no place in government. Government must be based on a justice morality. If you look at a document such as the Declaration of Independence, it outlines the purpose of government. And those things can be summed up in the following phrases: establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. At the very top is to establish justice. This is the chief purpose of a government. Without justice, there's no point in having a government at all. That is the primary function of a government. So when you have a justice-based morality and a care-based morality, these are mutually exclusive moralities. And while even a justice-based morality may allow for things like promoting the general welfare and caring for others, you cannot have a care-based morality and have it be just. In the video we just watched, it says that girls are less likely to consider what is fair. So to demonstrate this, there's actually an article in Psychology Today called "Sex on the Bench, Do Women and Men Have Different Moral Values?" It says, quote, "When looking at pictures of immoral acts, women's judgments of severity correlate with higher levels of activation in emotion centers of the brain, suggesting concern for victims, whereas men show higher activation in areas that might involve the deployment of principles. When men watch wrongdoers getting punished, there's activation in reward centers of their brains, whereas women's brains show activation in pain centers, suggesting that they feel empathy for suffering even when it is deserved. It also says, quote, evidence does suggest that gender matters on the bench. Unsurprisingly, female judges are more likely than male judges to rule in favor of plaintiffs alleging sex discrimination and in favor of female plaintiffs in disputes about property, alimony, and birth control. This pattern suggests that female judges are more protective of female interests. For example, quote, female judges were more likely than male judges to find a male defendant guilty of assault, and they imposed longer sentences. The article toward the end says, quote, the empirical evidence does suggest that changing gender ratios could yield a court that is more egalitarian, more concerned for victims of crime, and more protective of women, unquote. If you don't see the bullshit in all this, I don't know what to tell you. You have female judges favoring women and punishing men disproportionately because they're women, because they empathize with women, they have that own group preference. This is at the explicit expense of justice. To have a just society, to be equal before the law, you can't have this bullshit. But this is what we have when we have female judges, when we have female voters, when we have female politicians. They don't judge things justly because they don't have a justice-based morality. This is not something that we can just, educate them out of. This is based on their biology, their instincts. And when you have a government that takes a care-based morality and not a justice-based morality, the result is injustice. The result is discrimination against whatever party the judge doesn't favor. This is where identity politics comes from. I mean, if you want a system of justice where jurors just vote for someone based on the color of their skin or what genitalia they have without even taking into account the facts of the case, that you're talking about a care-based morality. You're talking about using someone's own group preference to make a determination based on right and wrong. Not based on the facts. Not based on objectivity. And that is the purpose of a government. I mean, if you like social justice, if you like identity politics, if you think those are great and you want more of them, then you probably have a care-based morality. If you disagree with identity politics and you want a system that's more objective, that looks at the facts and judges people and individuals, not what group they belong to or how sad they are, how many crocodile tears they shed in court, but actually the facts of the case, then you should not be in favor of women voting. Because when women vote, they bring their care-based morality into politics. And this in turn affects government at all levels. Female judges, female police officers, female politicians, all the way up and down. When women are involved in government, the result is we move from a justice-based morality to a care-based morality. And then we don't have justice anymore. It's as simple as that. You have to choose one. And this doesn't mean that not having women voting ensures a just government. I mean, you can have a corrupt government run by men, but you will definitely have a corrupt government when women are involved because they don't even believe in justice the way that men do. I mean, they can't conceptualize these abstract concepts. This is why when a man gives directions, he talks about like north, south, east, west, where women use landmarks. It's just more difficult for women to understand abstract concepts. And what are justice and morality other than abstract concepts? This is why women, in the absence of being able to conceptualize these abstract concepts, simply turn to in-group bias and empathy, their feelings. Women don't think, they feel. And this is antithetical to a good government. You can't have a government without justice. That's the primary function of a government. And yet that is what modern government has become, and I postulate it is because women were given the right to vote. And because women's voices became arguably more important than men's because they're the greater population, we now have a care-based moral system in government. A paternalistic, biased, identity politics-based system, rather than an objective system that values justice. Actual justice, not this social justice bullshit. But even understanding the differences between how men and women think, how they conceptualize justice and morality, and how antithetical to government female thinking is, it's not even the most important reason why women shouldn't vote. Because the real reason, the number one reason why women shouldn't vote is I could really sum up the main argument why women shouldn't vote by just saying women aren't responsible. They're not responsible at all. As a group, women are not responsible for themselves. They're not responsible for the government. They're not responsible for anything. Men are always responsible. Now, if you remember the famous Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility, if you have power, you should be responsible with that power. However, the inverse is also true. The right thing to do is, if you have responsibility, is to have authority and power commensurate with your responsibility. If you have parties where one person has all the power and one person has all the responsibility, you have oppression and tyranny. The best example I can think of is a whipping boy. You know, back in the day when you had these nobles who their children were never physically punished. So when they did something wrong, they would bring in a peasant boy and beat him instead of the noble. In this dynamic, the noble had no responsibility. They had all the power and authority, but no responsibility. Meanwhile, the peasant boy, who didn't do anything wrong, who was being whipped for what the noble child did, had all the responsibility and no authority or power. But if you just look historically, from the advent of modern feminism, even with first wave feminism, you had things like the White Feather Brigade, which is just this bullshit era of feminism where during World War I, they went around giving white feathers to men to shame them into enlisting in the army and dying in World War I. But regardless of the fact that World War I was kind of a stupid war that didn't even have a reason to be fought, not a single woman had to enlist. Not a single woman was asked to join the military to fight and die in the trenches with the men. And yet, they went around handing white feathers to the men to shame them so that they would go die instead. And Thorium did a video a while back, I'll link to it in the description, about children lying about their age, going off to war because they would rather face death than the shame of these women giving them white feathers. In fact, there were several boys who committed suicide because the women were basically badgering them for being cowards even when they were children. Not only were these women completely irresponsible for what they were asking the men to do, but they would use shame to get them to take responsibility for what they never intended to take responsibility for. It's like, I can't even think of a word, like hypocrisy doesn't even begin to describe it. How dare you? And even to this day, women are not subject to the draft. Not in the US. And while some women do serve in the military, it's not that much, especially where it counts. For example, according to CNN in 2011, 14.5% of the active duty force were women, with generals and admirals making up 7.1%. However, only 2.7% of the military's frontline units were women. And it says, quote, among the enlisted ranks, women were most represented in the medical, 30.5%, and administrative, 30.1% specialties. They made up about 17% of supply units, 14% of communication staff, and 10% of electronic technicians. Healthcare was the top field for female officers at 39%. They made up nearly 28% of administrative officers, 19% of intelligence officers, and 18% of supply officers. In the Navy, 46% of all female officers were in the medical field, unquote. So you can see that there's plenty of things for women to do in the military besides shoot a gun, with most women in the medical and administrative fields. And yet, even to this day in 2015, there's no female draft. Women have had the vote for almost 100 years. No female draft. Even to this day. Even despite women making up about 15% of the military these days. Still no draft. But what's really bullshit beyond the draft, even if women were subject to the draft tomorrow, I would still say women aren't responsible and should not be given the right to vote. The larger issue is, women aren't responsible for what the government does because they don't pay the taxes. I mean, going to war is definitely a huge responsibility placed on men in order to basically conscript them to serve the government. But taxes force you to serve the government every single year in wartime, peacetime, it doesn't matter. And men pay the overwhelming percentage of taxes. Not only do they pay the overwhelming percentage of taxes, women receive the overwhelming percentage of benefits. Now, I've assembled some charts from the IRS. Now, unfortunately, the government doesn't post controversial data anymore, especially since Obama's been president. But the last time they posted Excel-formatted data, broken up by gender of salaries and wages, was in 1998. They did it again in 2009, but it was in PDF format, and I can't convert it to an Excel document in order to run these calculations. But I did run these calculations for 1998. But in 1998, men made up 53.21% of the workforce in the US, while women made up 46.79% of the workforce. In total, men paid 70.21% of taxes in 1998, and women paid 29.79% of taxes in 1998. It's not like men and women pay a different tax rate, it's all based on income. Because men do most of the earning, they pay most of the taxes. Now, just because Obama stopped publishing this data in 2009 when he became president doesn't mean we can't make some inferences from other data points. For example, the gender wage gap has been published every year. So we can compare the gender wage gap in 1998 to the present day. Now, because men make most of the money and thus pay most of the taxes, if the gender wage gap has more or less stayed the same, we can reasonably assume that the gender tax gap has also stayed relatively the same. So according to the website payequity.org, on a page called The Wage Gap Over Time in Real Dollars, Women See a Continuing Gap, it lists the 1998 gender wage gap at 73.2%, and the 2014 gender wage gap as 78.6%. So we can reasonably conclude that the gender tax gap is still around 70%, if not worse. Men are paying at least 70% of taxes. Meanwhile, who uses welfare? It's women. Women use twice as much welfare across racial lines. White women use twice as much welfare as white men, black women use twice as much welfare as black men, and so forth. Women are overwhelmingly the recipients of tax-paid benefits, and men are overwhelmingly the payers of those taxes. Women have less skin in the game and receive more benefits than the men. Just think about that. Men are basically paying for women's benefits. The entire welfare state is just a redistribution from men to women. Now, these numbers are really not likely to change. Now, it's been against the law to pay women less for the same work for decades. The reason why men continue to out-earn women is because they do more dangerous work. I mean, the gender wage gap's been debunked a million times. I'm not going to beat that dead horse here. The point is, this isn't ever going to change. Men pay more taxes. Overwhelmingly, 70% at least. I wish more data was released. I wish I had something more recent than 1998 to work with, but you gotta do what you gotta do. But just think about how unjust and unfair it is that men pay the overwhelming percentage of taxes, while women receive the overwhelming percentage of benefits. What do men get for their taxes? How are men rewarded for all this responsibility put on their shoulders? They're the only ones subject to the draft? They pay the overwhelming percentage of taxes? And when it comes to politics, women outvote them. I mean, they are the definition of second-class citizens, supporting the system that exploits them, while the women are essentially the upper class. They are the nobles. They're being taken care of by the government, stealing from the 49% to give to the 51%. If you want to point the finger at a group that's responsible for growing the size and scope of government, that's responsible for raising your taxes, diminishing your freedom, it's not black people. They're like 12% of the population. It's women. They're 51% of the population. That's where the fault lies. The problem with the traditional conservatives is they don't want to blame women because they love women. They love their little women. But that's the problem. That's why we're never going to have a free society. We're never going to have a society that respects the taxpayer. As long as women can vote, we will not have a free and just society. Because women will just vote themselves men's money. Because they want to be taken care of. It's in their nature. It's their instinct to be taken care of by men. And if no one's going to marry them and do it, they'll just get the government to do it. Unless we stop them by not letting them vote. That is the clear, unambiguous solution to these problems in government. If you favor a large, bureaucratic welfare state, you probably have a vagina. I'm just saying. If you want to see the end of the welfare state, if you want to see the end of big government, confiscatory taxation, wars without end, you have to put the people who have skin in the game in charge of these decisions. When men don't control the government because they're the minority, when women have little to no skin in the game, when they're paying 30% of the taxes, receiving 70% of the benefits, and are exempt from mandatory military service? What other government do you expect to develop out of that system? But of course, it's a truth that dare not speak its name, because it offends people's sensibilities. We don't want to say that women shouldn't vote, because we've been told how glorious and wonderful egalitarianism is. That's this great hallmark of Western civilization, universal suffrage. It's fucking horseshit. Wake up. All of this is at the permission of men. Women don't have the power to enforce their own will. They have to use men to oppress other men in order to enforce their will. All men have to do is wake up. So those are my 3 reasons why women shouldn't vote. So this is Turd Flinging Monkey. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.